This is Module 8 of Accounting 3110, and the focus of this particular module, which is Module 8A actually, will be the first of 3 modules related to process costing. In process costing, we are looking at a different type of product costing system than what we studied when we did job order costing. In fact, it's helpful to compare process costing to job order costing, and we can look at the differences, and it makes the learning of this type of system much easier. So if we think about what we learned about job order costing, we learned that costs are accumulated by jobs, and every job is unique and can be specifically identified. So it was very easy to accumulate material, labor, and overhead cost for each job. Let's give an example of job order costing. Again, perhaps we're a printing company and we've just printed wedding announcements. This is a specific job. It's different than every other job, and the output of this job is a very specialized product, in this case a set of wedding announcements, which would be unique. If we're doing process costing, what we're dealing with is a situation where we cannot accumulate the cost by a job, because what we have here is a situation in perhaps a manufacturing environment where we're making something like cereal or an oil refinery, or perhaps we're making chemicals or soft drinks. And when we have products like this, we would describe these products as being homogeneous. Every unit looks like every other unit. So we're not able to attach the cost to every unit we make. What we do, and this is where it gets its name, process costing, is we accumulate the cost by department or by process. And once we have accumulated the cost by the department, then we're able to take those costs and assign the cost to all the units that pass through that department. And so we are dealing with a very, very different type of product or output when we're doing process costing. And the key feature of the product will be that we are making a homogeneous product where we cannot tell one unit from another. When we talk about process costing, we must understand the flowchart that we worked on in several modules. We are going to again relate to that flowchart, and we will be specifically looking at the work in process account. And I'd like to demonstrate for you an example with the flowchart and how this flowchart relates again to this new subject of process costing. If we recall the worksheet that we've been using, the flowchart, we had direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. We had a work in process account. We had finished goods. And of course we have cost of goods sold, and all the costs of course are going to move that direction. What we're seeing in process costing is we may have multiple work in process accounts. For example, if we were making soft drinks, this first work in process account might be the mixing department, and the next might be the cooling department or the cooling process. And then finally, maybe the third work in process account would be the bottling department. And what we want to keep in mind is that we're going to accumulate the cost here, and we are going to assign the cost within this department to all units that move through the department. The same with this, and the same with bottling. And as our units move through the flowchart, they will physically move through the flowchart, and their cost will also move forward. So when the units move to the next department, the costs go with them. It's very important when we do process costing that we look at the work in process account and what it means. When work is in process, it is not completed. So what takes place in these departments is we have units that are partially done and may not be 100% done. Because of this, we're going to need to keep track of our direct material cost separately from our conversion cost. You'll remember that conversion cost refers to direct labor and factory overhead. So as we work on process costing, we will group the product cost in terms of direct material and in terms of conversion cost. Let me give you an example. If we were making a basic wooden desk, we may be making a desk and it has all the materials. It looks like it would be finished. All the parts are there, but we would say in that case it's 100% complete as to materials, but perhaps what it needs is to be sanded one more time. And if it needs to be sanded one more time, then it would not be 100% complete in terms of conversion cost. So you can have a work in process that may be complete as far as direct materials, but maybe less than complete in terms of conversion cost. Now, I think it's very, very important at this stage to talk about what are we trying to do when we do process costing, and it really is quite simple. If you think about the work in process account, on the left side, you have any beginning cost, and then you add the cost of the current period. What will end up happening is on that left side of the work in process account, we know that those are all the costs that we have to account for. When the end of the period comes, we must assign those costs, and they're going to be assigned in one of two places, and you'll recall this again from an earlier module. We will either assign the cost to what was transferred out, which is the right side of the work in process account, or we will assign the cost to ending inventory. So it becomes very important that we understand that the dollars that we have to account for will be accounted for either through transferred out or ending inventory. There's an equation that we can use too to demonstrate how this works, and I'd like to share that with you now and just give you a basic example of how all this relates again to the flow chart and how we can use this equation when we do process costing. As I mentioned before, the work in process account, you may have beginning dollars or you may not, but then you will have current period cost. And we talked about this before, that all the costs that are represented in the square are either going to end up here in ending inventory or related to the units that get transferred out. So let me say this very clearly. The purpose of process costing is to assign the costs that we see in this part of the account either here or both. When we talk about process costing too, it's very helpful to use the equation that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. There's an equation that says if you take beginning plus transferred in, sometimes we refer to that as started, this will always equal transferred out plus ending inventory. Now let's go back. Let me show you the work in process T account again. This would be beginning inventory. These are costs that are transferred in, current period cost, and you know that they come from direct material, direct labor, and factory overhead. And what we're saying is beginning inventory plus the transferred in must always equal the transferred out plus ending inventory. So we are going to take all of these costs, if we turn these into dollars, and we are going to assign them to either transferred out or ending inventory. Concerning this formula too, or this equation, we've seen it before because we know we can take, for example, the beginning plus the transferred in dollars, subtract the transferred out, and get ending inventory. And there are multiple other ways that we can reorganize this equation. But this is really what we're doing with process costing. We're going to take the beginning cost plus the current period cost, and we're going to assign these costs to transferred out and ending inventory. The transferred out, this would move to the next work in process account or perhaps finished goods. But the ending inventory, you know what we will do with this. This will go on the balance sheet and be included in our inventory asset accounts. As we learn about equivalent units of production too, I want you to refer to your lecture notes for this Module 8A and take a look at the hierarchy that we will use as we learn to do process costing. The simplest level is to work a problem where we have no beginning or ending inventory. When we move to our second example, we will have some ending inventory. In the third example, we'll have both beginning and ending. By the time we hit example 4, we'll be looking at prior department cost and how those are handled. And finally, the fifth example will involve spoiled units and talk about how we assign costs not just to transferred out and ending inventory, but we'll also have to assign some costs to the spoiled units. Now let me say here in the first module in Module 8A, and when you come back and we look at Module 8B, we're going to be using the weighted average method. The companies have a choice whether they use weighted average or the FIFO method. And the FIFO method we will learn in a separate module, and that will be Module 8C. But again, the first two modules we're going to be using the weighted average process. So as we think about process costing, we can picture the kind of products where this type of system would be appropriate. We're making cereal, we're refining oil, we're making chemicals, we're making soft drinks. We've talked about how the work in process account is where it's all at in this type of problem, how we're going to keep track of the cost from the beginning inventory plus the current cost, and we are going to assign those cost to either what was transferred out or what was left at the end of the period called ending inventory. Now there's just one more thing for me to show you before we start talking about working a process costing problem and working through maybe 2 examples in this module. We are going to have to convert what we call physical units to what we are going to learn to call equivalent units. Because we're dealing with work in process accounts, we said this earlier, that means that if they're in work in process, they're not complete. So we're going to deal with units that are partially complete in terms of materials and in terms of conversion cost. So I want to give you an example, and if you would jot this down as I go through this can be a good example for you to come back to when you're trying to make sure you understand the concept of equivalent units. Equivalent units simply means we're going to look at the amount of work done, the actual work done, rather than the actual physical unit. Let's look in terms of the example I'd like you to jot down has to do with higher education, particularly one class that I taught. I had 21 students in the class, so there were 21 physical people taking a course that I taught. 10 of these students were full-time students. 5 were half-time students, and 6 students were only taking one class, so they were really quarter-time students. So let's think about this. There were 21 physical units, but here at ETSU and every other institution of higher education, they look at what we call full-time equivalents, FTEs. So how would I convert from physical units to FTEs? Well, I had 10 full-times, so that I'll count all 10 of them. I had 5 half-times, so 5 times a half would be 2.5. And I had 6 quarter times, which would be another 1.5 FTEs. So we have 10 plus 2.5 plus 1.5. So we had 14 FTEs represented in that class. Now we're going to do the same thing with process costing. We're going to convert from physical units to what we call equivalent units. And we will be able to do that because the production people will come to us at the end of the period and they will say, these units are X% complete in terms of materials or conversion cost. When we work a process costing type of problem, we always move through 5 steps. And one of the first things we need to talk about as we look at this first example would be that flow or that sequencing of 5 steps. So I want to get this for you. You will find this in your textbook and you will find the sequence in your notes. But we're going to look at the physical units and determine them first. The physical units. Secondly, we're going to calculate the equivalent units. So we're going to move from physical to what we call equivalent units of production. Then we're going to determine what our costs are. And if you will look at step 3, we know our cost, and in step 2, we know our equivalent units. So we should be able to easily calculate the cost per equivalent unit. And finally, we talked about this earlier, the 5th step to process costing is to assign cost to what was transferred out or to ending inventory. So these are the 5 steps for process costing. And regardless of our example, if we have an easy example, a simple example, or we have a complex example, we will always move through this sequence. If you could refer back to the hierarchy that is in your lecture notes for Module 8A, again, you'll notice that there are 5 levels of problems, with the simplest being a problem that has no beginning and no ending inventory. And when we have this situation, we really don't have to deal at all with partial units because everything that is started is completed. And instead of the cost being assigned to transferred out and ending inventory, of course, it's just all going to be assigned to transferred out. So just the example 1, I just want to show you a T account and show you how very simple this would be. You have your cost being materials and conversion costs, $16,000 for material, $5,600 for conversion costs, the $21,600. And when you have an example 1, no beginning and no ending, what will happen is all $21,600 will be transferred out. And there will be nothing here in ending inventory. Again, because everything started and completed, we don't even have to talk about equivalent units. So we're going to move on and look at example 2, which is 1 step higher in complexity. And in example 2, we're going to have no beginning inventory, but we will have an ending inventory. So I'm going to work through these 5 steps for you. And we'll talk about each step as we go. But once again, in this particular example, example 2, and the data is in your lecture notes for this module. Example 2, no beginning inventory. It has an ending inventory, and that ending inventory is 100% complete as to materials, but only 20% complete as to conversion cost. So no beginning inventory, but the problem says that we started 8,000 units. And this is going to give us a total of 8,000 units to account for. Transferred out, we are going to be transferring out 6,000 units. There are 2,000 in ending inventory. Again, 8,000 units have been accounted for. When we move to step 2, this is about equivalent units of production, and we are going to move away from physical units to equivalent units. So let's look at the transferred out category, and these are always 100% complete or they wouldn't be transferred out. So we have 6,000 physical units at 100%, so we will just easily calculate the equivalent units for transferred out. The ending inventory, as we mentioned earlier, is 100% done in terms of materials, and this is common because in a lot of processes the materials get dumped in at the very beginning, and so even though we're not through making the units, we still have more conversion to do. They may be 100% complete as to materials very early in the production process. 20% complete as to conversion cost. So we take our 2,000 units, 2,000 times 20% is 400. So we've got 8,000 EQUs for material and 6,400 for conversion cost. In step 3, all we want to do is to summarize all the cost for the particular problem, and this is always given to us in the problem. So we just take a look at the cost in terms of beginning inventory and the cost that relates to the current period. Well, in this case, we had no beginning inventory, so there's not going to be any beginning inventory cost in this type of problem. The cost for the current period, we had 16,000 in materials, 5,600, total 21,600. Okay. So again, in this type of problem, you don't have to worry about any cost related to beginning inventory since there was none. All right, now what we want to do is to take these costs, divide by our equivalent units. So we bring down our EQUs, and we have 8,000, we had 6,400. And keep in mind, these are dollars, and these are EQUs. When we divide this, we get $2 per EQU for materials, 0.875 for conversion cost, and those two together, total cost per unit, 2.875. So at this point, we have figured that we have to account for 8,000 units, and we have accounted for that many units in terms of what was transferred out and left in ending inventory. We moved on to calculate our equivalent units. We summarized the cost, and in this case, the cost all related to the current period, and we calculated a cost per equivalent unit. Now, the last step, which is step 5, is going to involve assigning the cost. Where will we assign the $21,600? So what we're trying to do in step 5 is to arrive at these two numbers. So let's look at the transferred out. We look at your transferred out EQUs they were 6,000 EQUs at the full cost, and this becomes 17,250, and this is the transferred out amount. Now when we look at ending inventory, I'll refer you back to step 2. You have to look at the EQUs that relate to the ending. So there were 2,000 in materials and 400 EQUs related to conversion. So you have to go back to step 2 to get these figures. You go to step 4 to find your cost per EQU, and we know what those are. The material was $2, and this was 0.875. So we do the calculations. We get 4,000 for materials. We get 350 for conversion. And so the total for the ending inventory is 4,350. And when we add what was transferred out to what was in ending inventory, this should exactly add up to how many costs we had to account for. Let's go back and put those in the T account. 16,000, 5,600, and these do tie back. We will have the 21,600 to account for, and we have assigned 21,600 between transferred out and ending inventory. So as we look at completing this particular module 8A, it's important for us to take away what process costing is about, how it contrasts with job order costing. We want to think about the 5 steps that we've learned today, and the purpose being in process costing to finally assign the cost to either the goods that were transferred out or were left in ending inventory. For the next module, which we call Module 8B, we will be looking at the next 3 examples having to do with situations where we have beginning and ending inventory, where we have prior department cost, and finally where we have costs that must be assigned to the spoilage.